So welcome back to another edition of the Heart to Heart podcast. And my guest today is Dan Freiheit. So Dan is the founder of Lion Advocacy, and he's working out of Toronto as a lawyer. So Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So Dan, just before we get started and I start firing off some questions, can you just give the audience a little bit of a brief background about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a lawyer, a corporate commercial specialist, they call me, the Law Society of Ontario. But my involvement in COVID-related stuff happened, it was about a year and a half ago when I started getting a lot of calls about employees that had been terminated, what companies should be doing with workplace mandates and the like. So I realized around February 2022, I realized when things started to change, but they weren't changing, meaning I realized more than just law was required to get some ideas out there. So that's when I started on the side, this Lion Advocacy kind of Twitter handle to get documents out there that are in the public domain and to raise awareness about some of the issues that I was spotting as a lawyer, as a corporate lawyer.
And so what was the main issue that came up first, or what sort of caught your attention that, hey, this is something that's, unjust or unlawful, and this is the first thing that I gotta tackle? I'm assuming probably the mandates, but I'll let you answer.
It's funny, I started noticing things. A lot of people have been noticing weird things way before COVID, right? But like certain things in the regulatory sphere, there were a couple of regulatory cases that really got me concerned about where things were headed. But in terms of in terms of just the law and the evolution of the law, I started getting a bit concerned a bit before COVID. But what really got me out there was in February 2022, when it was publicly, announced that the vaccines weren't working for COVID, right? And to stop transmission. And the policies that were supposed to be temporary, and were designed for certain purpose weren't being changed. That's when I realized like there was a miscommunication going on a massive scale, right? And so that's kind of what got me really concerned. Everything up to then, I know February 2022 was still there'd been already a year of crazy stuff going on. But
2 years at February 2022.
Good point.
Yeah.
It's all a blur. You see, it's all a blur.
Yeah, it's crazy how fast the last 3 years have gone.
And this is why everyone's like, where were the lawyers? And like this, I'm trying to scratch my head now. Like, what was going on? Like, I think we were affected personally by a lot of the lockdowns, a lot of the mayhem. And so why my advocacy took this long to get out, like that's the question I still kind of struggle with. I think I don't know, everyone seemed to be managing,
Yeah.
In my circle, like people were, you just weren't hearing crazy cases. It was like things were getting by, but
Everyone, I think, just kind of thought that it was going to end, like it wasn't going to
right.
carry on for this long. And even though people were kind of warning, like I remember even at the beginning in May, like I had a concert I was supposed to go to with a bunch of my friends from Newfoundland. We are going to go to Boston Calling. And anyways, all of us were like, oh, like it'll be over by then, like in March of 2022, like we'll still be able to go to that concert, it won't be a big deal. And then the madness just kind of like ensued. So I think that everyone, and I think also too, and again, I'm not saying that a lot of people didn't get the vaccine to protect themselves, they did, and I'm sure that it did protect a lot of people, but at this, particularly when they didn't have natural immunity. But at the same time, I think that that's why it just kind of continued, was because people were just like, well, it can't be like this forever. It's gonna go away. It's they're not gonna lock us up forever. And
right.
then, they kind of did, and they did it in a way where it was sort of like, we'll give you a little bit, but then we're gonna take some back, and we're gonna give you a little bit and take some back. And I think everyone just kind of got caught in this loop, and then all of a sudden it's 2 to 3 years later, and we're still being affected by this. And again, I mean, at the beginning too, it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve,
Right.
and now it's been 3 years.
And then they relaxed, and then it was like, then there was this new, like a new crazy emergency that they had to like lock down for. So we were kind of like constantly like, trusting these views and these policies that were, it was a kind of a gray area, at least for, I don't know, for some of us. Others were like, this is ridiculous from from the get-go. Those were like, people who knew more about how, I don't know, where they anticipated this going, people with more background about some of the policies, the global policies that had been on the table for a while. Like, I just wasn't aware of any of this stuff. So for me, the flag is February 2022, when Moore, Dr. Tam came out and said, vaccines aren't doing what we hoped. They publicly acknowledged that. I'm like, okay, so they're not stopping transmission. So now we got to revamp everything. But then it was just like inertia. Nobody was changing. I'm like, no, guys, it's folks, it's time to, it's time to change. And nobody was changing. I was like, okay, man, I got to get out there. I got to let people know,
Yeah.
the things have shifted now. Now it's time to stop. February 22, now is time to stop. And they weren't stopping. And then the federal government just got even worse. That's when the federal government really started cracking down. Like, that makes no sense. Man, that made no sense. So that's where I really, and I was getting weird legal calls, like calls from people that were working remotely that are now being terminated. I'm like, well, how are you? And they have been working fine for 2 years. Now they're terminating them without notice for misconduct. I'm like, this is the sign. This is a bad sign. I see myself, holy cow. Getting called, one individual, 20 years, had been on, like, the most loyal employee you could imagine, accommodated the remote environment, suffered, because it's not easy to work remotely either, suffered through that,
It's not.
right? Isolate, like, that's hard for these folks. And
I think
wasn't
working
even,
from home is completely overrated, in my opinion. I know some people disagree with that. I don't mean to go off on a tangent there, but I
no,
just wanted to make that point. Go ahead.
I'm with you on that one. I think there are some advantages, some flexibility, but I think people underestimate the cost of isolation.
Yeah.
They are not aware of the cost, in some cases, the lethal cost. And I was actually thinking about this on the way to our podcast today, but I'm like, can isolation be like, can it be, like morbidly, can it cause serious health consequences? Like, I had cases where I could tell isolation was going to, seriously harm this person. I'm like, you got to get help immediately.
Yeah.
That was one individual who was in quarantine, who was being, denied exit from a quarantine. I'm like, I mean, you're having a mental health, you got to get help immediately. I don't care what the, security guard's telling you got to get. So that was that, like, cases like that, man.
Yeah,
Oh,
I agree with you there, because when you look at this, like, excessive deaths graph, and there was one that came out a day or two ago. Kevin Bass had pointed it out. I think I had retweeted it as well. But it looks like the lockdowns did kill people in a lot of ways, because and how did they do that? Well, people weren't getting outside, so they weren't getting any fresh air, any sunlight, which contributes to lower well-being. They weren't getting any physical activity. The biggest one, which I probably should have mentioned first, is that a lot of people, their financial situation changed drastically. And as we know, when you have financial stress, that really wreaks havoc on your mental health. Suicides were up, drug overdoses were up, so all these things, I think, came about from the lockdowns. I think a lot of people want to point to the vaccine, but if you look at the data, it looks like the countries that locked down have a lot of excessive deaths, and the countries that did not have. And again, I'm pointing, the country I'm pointing to the most is Sweden. So in this particular graph, it's Sweden that's at the very bottom, and Sweden is a highly vaccinated country, fairly highly vaccinated. I don't know the exact number, but I think they are fairly highly vaccinated. So to me, it seems to me that the lockdowns were the bigger contributor to these excessive deaths that we've been noticing.
so yeah, and that statement, right? That statement coming from you, got to be careful with that, right? Like, CPSO, Big Brother's watching you now. Like, what's your evidence? Can you say that without evidence? What is your evidence? That evidence is disputed, right? Sweden, like, they were they were easy on, they were easy, they didn't lock down, but they were they had a lot of deaths from COVID, didn't they? Like, it was not a walk in the park for them.
It's true. I'm just talking in particular about a graph that came out a day or two ago. Again, it was
Okay.
Kevin Bass who had retweeted it, and there was a list of countries in Europe, and looking at excessive deaths.
Right.
And it looked like it was like a Census Bureau document, like it wasn't something that someone just had like fabricated this kind of evidence or anything like that. And it
Right.
just, it appeared that on this graph, Sweden was the very lowest. So
But
from that, you would, think that again, I'm not making any claims or making any definitive claims. We're just having, an open discussion here. We're still trying to figure it all out. Like I'm still trying to figure it all out. I'm not saying I have all the answers or this is what it is. But if you look at that graph, it would appear that, lockdowns may have contributed to excessive deaths. That's
well, but even right, and even on a case by case, I could tell you flat out, like you say, what happens when, I mean, we talk about lockdowns too, because no one was bolted into their homes. It was more of a psychological lockdown. I mean, people still could go for walks. People still could get out and about. So there, when we say lockdowns, like what are we actually referring to, right? People
yeah,
were encouraged to go for walks. You get out, they were encouraged to get out and about. But there was, yes, this fear that, rightly or wrongly was implanted people, and they weren't like my exercise routine. Like I was exercising a lot before COVID. Um, I haven't. Like I was kicked out of the gyms, and that's really set me back. Like now I'm concerned about
yeah.
getting back on that. Right. So
No,
the,
that's a big point too. Not to go off on a tangent again, but it's
you'll go
very
off on a lot of tangents with me.
it's very difficult to initiate an exercise program. Once you have initiated an exercise program, it's not easy to keep going, but it's certainly easier to keep going than to initiate again. And so a
Right.
lot of people, it took them a long time to get that momentum, and then that momentum's been taken away, and now they need to get back to that initiation stage. And that is not easy for a lot of people to do. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yes, and that is like I'm just thinking of my own personal situation. Like I was very regimented and vigorous with my exercise routine. Even saunas, like basic health components that I would lift 120. Still going to try, but I got to get back on that. I got to get back on in that mindset, right? And now with things, it's like I think the pandemic itself created a lot of disruption. Just having to deal with well, with everything, higher workloads now, less people in the workforce. So, having to compensate for, a reduced workforce. And what my point of all this is that, yeah, for me, the ultimate test, I guess, or the ultimate way to see if you're exerting too much force on a population is if they're starting to not comply. Okay. And what level of force you then use against those who don't comply with whatever it is that they're suffering with. Meaning, some people suffer with masks, and there's only so much force you can use when you want to get someone to mask up if they have psychological or whatever it is, or reactions to a mask. So I don't advocate, or I don't think it's a good idea to trespass people who aren't wearing a mask if they can't mask, or people that are violating lockdown, if they're just doing political protests. That's one thing, but even at that, if someone's having a trouble with a lockdown or has to get out of a quarantine, don't ease up on the use of force. Just let it go, let it fly. Unless they're like a super spreader and they're coughing all over the place and they have right, like you just ease up on the enforcement. And that's why I wear this hat a lot. It's my GCT, and they're not a paid sponsor, but they really should be. Prior to COVID, like I was interested, it's important to know about how use of force training. Okay, I was once trying to get into the Army, and I like law enforcement. Tactical use of force is something that everyone needs to understand. All civilians in Canada have to understand how the concept works. Okay, how to escalate force against someone, right? Someone who can't endure a mask, who doesn't want to wear a mask, or who doesn't want to comply with lockdown, you have to just use some force, but not like the force we've been seeing in Canada. Like that's not, no way. You see on, how they went in Quebec, they went crazy on folks who were in a Tim Hort. Like there's just way too many incidents of disproportionate use of force for people that were suffering with whatever it was, either it's lockdowns or if it's masking. Like ease up on the use of force. Anyhow.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I'm someone who is, a big supporter of the police, and I have a lot of police that are friends. I train
Nice.
with a lot of cops. So I'm a friend of theirs, but I do agree with you that I think there was a lot of excessive use of force, particularly the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. I think, we saw a lot of the videos of people kind of getting trampled and things like that. Like
Yeah.
that was way, way, way out of hand. I don't know too much about the incident that you're talking about in Quebec. Maybe there's more than one. Yeah, like what was the exact incident in
In
Quebec that
Quebec,
kind of caught your eye?
in Quebec, it was just someone in a Tim Hortons who was refusing to wear a mask, and they were told to leave the premises, and they refused. And technically, under the law, yeah, you can use escalating use of force to get that person out of there, right? You ask them to leave, you put your hand on them if they resist, you right? But this person, I think they went from zero to from zero to hero pretty fast in terms of taking out the pepper spray or whatever it was, and really ejecting them, like getting them out when they wanted them out. The belief being that anyone not wearing a mask is going to spread COVID immediately, and they have to be immediately removed from the premises. Like that's the idea. If somebody had tuberculosis, or I think that was the standard before COVID. I think there are certain certain contagious diseases that you use escalated force pretty quickly. Meaning, if someone's hacking with tuberculosis and you know that they're like, yeah, get law enforcement in there, get them off immediately. But a mask or unvaccinated, asymptomatic, it makes me, makes certain people uncomfortable. But I don't need to force you off the property immediately, and I don't need to take out a 2-year trespass notice on you. If you're going to come back with symptoms like that, then we'll have to have a chat.
Yeah.
The funniest thing I saw, from my perspective, was going into the pharmacy, and somebody. This is when masks were big, and I was wearing masks. The person beside me wasn't coming into the pharmacy, and the lady at the door said, "You have to put on a mask." And the gentleman just said, "Not today, thanks," and he just walked right in. And that was the extent of the interaction. Meaning, I forgot it. It's not unreasonable. It's not. I'm not going to spread COVID to 15 people right now. It's annoying. It's rude, but she let it go. He went in. Was out in 2 minutes, as opposed to arresting him in the store, a struggle. If he is symptomatic, you're going to cause way more damage by spreading, right, by getting into the officers, arresting. Like you're dealing with a collective mindset that departed from the force of reason. And I like the force of reason way more than the force of use of force, like physical force.
Yeah, like that's to me is completely insane, because your goal is to reduce the spread. So if your goal is to reduce the spread, what you would want to do is more or less like isolate that person to a certain
Right.
degree. So you would not want to have them be confrontational and then getting up in the face of the employees and the police officers and that kind of thing. So it really is completely a contradiction to what they're actually trying to achieve by implementing these really aggressive uses of force. So I completely agree with you on that. Like, and it just makes scientific sense. And I think that most police officers would actually agree with us as well. I think a lot of them, don't want to tell people to stop wearing a mask. I think they'd rather go, catch an actual criminal. I don't think
Right.
if you're not wearing a mask, you're a criminal. Again, are there dangers of not wearing a mask if you're symptomatic? For sure. But overall, I think that we had the completely wrong approach there.
And everyone blames the police officers. You're like, well, why did they do it? Like, the police officers are in a bit of a conflict in that situation, right? Like they
They
have to
are.
comply with their duties, and they'll get written up if they don't follow whatever policy it was. And I'd be curious to see what the policies were in terms of arrest, detainment of non-compliant, of trespassers at the time. I'd be curious, but
Yeah.
like I say, if the goal is to get the person out, with the minimum amount of breaths, exhale and particulate matter in the air, like I think, I'm not an expert in use of force and breath work, but I think you're going to probably spread more particles by escalating force like that. So anyhow, this is part of an analysis that would be beneficial for like a debrief at some point
Yeah.
post-pandemic. But like, we're all waiting for the debrief.
All waiting. I agree. One thing I wanted to chat with you about today, because I know you've tweeted about it recently, and I do live in London, Ontario, and I did do my residency at Western. So, Western University, had these mask mandates, or sorry, not mask mandates. Maybe it was mask mandates as well, but they
They had
definitely had, yeah, mask mandates and vaccine mandates implemented in the fall of 2022. So just recently, like a few months ago. And at that point, I'm going to quote Jay Bhattacharya and Marty McCary, who are both on my podcast before as well, who testified before Supreme Court recently. And they indicated that even in early-ish, I forget the exact date, it might be February, March of 2022, they had estimated that well over 90% of people had natural immunity at that point, right? So,
Wow.
you know, we're talking about a time when most people had natural immunity, and we're also talking about an age group, you know, university students who are very healthy and who do very, very well with COVID overall, right? So, you know, I think that, you know, if you have natural immunity and you're young, you're extremely low risk. And you know, the board that does I forget what NASA stands for now, but
National Advisory Committee on Immunization.
yeah, so you know they released something recently. It was very quiet, not really too much big news about it, but what they indicated, I'm sure you've seen it too, is that now they're not requiring anybody above the age of 18 to get a booster unless they are moderately to severely immunocompromised. I think that's the
Right.
exact language that they used. And then they even said, if you're in between the age of 65 to 79, so you're talking about a much higher risk population, if you've been previously infected, that you should only consider, I forget the exact wording again, you can, anyone can go look it up, then you can consider getting a booster, which basically means that they're acknowledging natural immunity, right? Because they're
Right.
saying that if you have been previously infected, consider getting a booster. So it doesn't, it appears that they have, made these kind of acknowledgments, but it's not getting any like mainstream coverage. And, I'm not really sure why. And again, the reason why I bring up those recommendations was because those recommendations are now they do not reflect what the mandates were for Western University back in fall, because they were saying that everyone should get boosted. You can't come to this university unless you get boosted. And now we're saying that the committee is saying that, advises Canadians on immunizations that you don't need to get boosted. So, I mean,
Right.
that's a massive conflict there.
Well, I think Western was, yeah, initially they said boosters coming in January will be required, and then they eased up on that. Then I think the language of they weren't sure about that. NACI, though, still, I think, I don't know how they've worded it now with prior infection. They still recommend the 2-dose regimen for all, I think there's, right, for all age groups. I gotta double check that.
Yeah, I was talking about boosters only,
Boosters,
just
right.
then. Boosters only, yeah.
Yeah, the boot, and I don't know, in the States, I think some of the highest levels universities are still requiring boosters. Isn't that like Stanford, Yale, like all those folks?
They were, I think, for sure in the fall. I don't know if they are in the winter semester right now. But I believe they were in the fall. Yeah. And yeah,
Wait,
like you said, it was a lot of the like higher like Ivy League type of universities that were making these requirements. And you figure
places
that
places that should know better.
yeah.
So, which goes to tell you, by the way, which is a signal about governance, okay? Which goes to tell you how these decisions are being made, who's making these decisions. This is what I've noticed from a corporate governance level, okay? The person making the decision isn't necessarily, first of all, they may not have correct authorization to make this decision. So when you say Yale has decided on this policy, like you got to go behind the scenes and check, well, how is this approved? How is this authorized, right? Same thing with your CPSO. They had a 2-dose requirement to get into public meetings. I'm like, who authorized that policy? They tell me, oh, it's an HR policy. I'm like, I'm not HR. I don't work for you guys. They're like, okay, well, it's our policy. I'm like, where? Who did your council approve this? It has to be approved by council, unless you're in the 2-week emergency where maybe the registrar has authority. So a lot of these authorities across big institutions haven't been properly, it hasn't been properly affected. Even my law society, I don't think the CEO had authority to block unvaccinated members of the population, lawyers and public from the law library up until August 15th, 2022. There was no emergency order. Like where's your authority for that? Operational. Oh, because it's done through a corporate statement. What's a corporate statement? This has to be approved by the convocation. It has to be approved by the members. If you're going to, even all the lawyers, I think, have to, approve of this, because it's really a constitutional change. It is a constitutional change. You're literally changing the constitution of who's going to form the new, the new incoming lawyers when you exclude prospects from the law library. The law library is like a spiritual sanctuary. So, right. So all these Western, same thing. Who signed off on this policy? And they run for the exits when I try to grill them on this. Nobody can answer this. I'm like, okay, if you don't answer, let me speak to your lawyer. You won't give me the lawyer's name. Like, it is unbelievable that they will not back any of this up with solid, firm, corporate authority. It's crazy. That to me was, I think I mentioned it, badges of fraud, like we call it in real estate. When there's something stinky like that going on, I can't even,
Yeah, it's difficult when, people are implementing these policies that are affecting other people's lives and they don't really have any evidence to kind of back up what they're saying, and not necessarily even evidence, but as you just pointed out, anything that's actually in the law.
Right. Like the evidence, look, if they have the evidence, okay, show it. Can't in camera. But no. What's your evidence? What cabinet confidence, Trudeau calls it. You can't hide the evidence of if your policies. And I think we're all starting to know now why, because look what Dr. Moore said yesterday. He said people have, all the organizations have to have policies. He was very dodgy about what the policies had to be. If people, because of I think he used the word belief system. If their belief system led them to make policies that were more draconian than the science allowed, well, that's their belief system. Okay, so it's not science, it's a belief system. I have belief systems too that, anyhow.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I get it. I mean, I think that, people should be allowed to like make their own policies to some degree. But if we're saying that people should be allowed to make their own policies, then that means that people should be allowed to either, implement certain policies or not implement certain policies. So you should be able to give people, both ways, not just
right,
one way, right?
Exactly. You could,
And
right. So write to the CEO, say, oh, can you just give me, like, I just want a day in the library, let me in for a day. No, this is our policy. Oh, but now wait, this is your policy. You could easily write an exemption. No, we're following the science. No, you're not. This is not. Anyhow.
I hate that term too, the science. Like, when did that come about? Like, there's like, science is science. Like, the science means like a lot of the time just like government propaganda. That's what a lot of the times what the science means. No one's ever used this term before. Like, it's ridiculous. And people use it to kind of, I think, like, posture themselves up a bit. Like, oh, like, I'm following the science.
You are
You're
getting
not
into
following the science. So like, I'm better than you. Like, it's ridiculous.
I don't, interesting. You're getting into an area, by the way. Okay. Forensic linguistics. Okay. When it's the analysis of language, it's basically standard lawyering, and I guess you do it to some extent as doctors, but it's really this analysis of language. Okay. And understanding how terms are used for certain purposes. You're right. When did this term, the science, follow the science as a lawful order? You know what I mean? And when did that evolve? When did that start? That'd be a great, research topic for an expert in linguistics, forensic linguistics. Follow the science.
Yeah, it's definitely a very, very odd term for sure. One thing that I wanted to ask you about too is, there's been some groups that have gotten a lot of governmental funding that have, they say that they're trying to, stop the spread of misinformation in Canada. And it seems like, and I hate to like pick on them. I hope I don't get any trouble for this, but there's a group, Science Up First.
Oh, I never heard of these folks.
And I don't know. I know that they were paid to actually, put out their messaging. And to me, like, is there any, is that like unlawful? Like, is there conflict of interest there? It's like we're getting these, there's a, this guy, his name's Tim Caulfield. He's actually a lawyer, and he's not a
Yes.
doctor. And he's put together this group, and then he says he's, his goal is to stop the spread of misinformation, but it's like he's being paid by the government. So he's being paid to basically, or being paid to, tweet out things that the government tells him to do. It's not like he's like an independent third party that looks at medical journals and, tweets out, things that are objective based upon what he looks at. Like, he has an agenda to push out what they want him to push out. Like, to me, that seems like it's incredibly unethical. Do you have any comment on that?
I did. I actually just thinking about this yesterday. First of all, I didn't know he's behind Science Up. What is it? Science Up First?
Science Up First.
That's
Yeah.
his group?
Yeah, there's a bunch of them. I don't know everybody in the group, but I know that that's like
So
one of the
the
groups.
question I was pondering yesterday, and I think I was thinking about Tim in specific because he was one of the articles, he was declared the expert in misinformation. He was like, literally, that's his new, like, one of his credentials. I'm like, but wait a second, you got that, you're getting all your funding to get that declaration from the federal government, like, or not all, but you're getting a significant money. Like, how much? Let's talk about it. But if your sponsor, right, is the federal government, and that's important to know, I don't think it automatically disqualifies someone as like necessarily affects their judgment, even though, they do say, money tends to can that's what bribes are. I think someone really loyal to their oath, okay, someone who's has a sworn oath will not be, there's a risk, but I think it can be overcome, right? So it really depends on the person. And how they live their lives. Okay, lawyers are paid by their clients, and they do sometimes have this issue, meaning the clients will ask them to do something either unlawful or to participate in a scheme that's somewhat and to grease the lawyer a bit, to pay them more, or to or just to, like, if there's a question of ethics, legal ethics, heavy paying clients will blind the eyes of the lawyer, and so it comes up in law too. And you have it too. You're paid. Look, you're paid by the provincial government, or the right, indirectly, directly.
I am.
So are you bought and paid for? Like, so I can't rely on you to form an opinion against the provincial government because they feed you. No, I trust that you've sworn an oath. I think. Did you actually swear an oath as part of your?
We do.
Royal College?
I don't have like the Royal College distinction because I'm a family physician, but
Okay.
Throughout medical school, at some point you
No, I want to know where did you raise your hand and swear your oath? I want to know the date, the time, and what your oath was.
I would not be able to give you all that information, but I do remember that it did happen at one point. But I should actually know that. It's kind of strange.
I can tell you the date and time I took my oath as a lawyer.
Well, you know what? I guess you have a better memory than I do. I can't really
No, I think
give you an answer to that one.
Because we're called to the bar, so I think it's part of that. We have to say it at that time. Anyhow, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I trust you have an oath. You have a doctor's oath. I know your oath, right? And so Tim Coffey, I'm assuming, I don't know if he has an oath. What's his oath, right? If he doesn't have an oath, then yeah, then I'm a bit concerned. He's more likely to be bought and paid for by by his handlers. So and I don't want to spread misinformation. I'd be happy to have this chat with him directly. Like, are you influenced?
Too.
Right? Get him on the show. Let's go through it. And it's not going to be the topic of conversation. I don't appear on any anti-vax podcast. Like, okay, what do you mean by anti-vax? What you're accusing us of something that's pretty important there. I've never been anti-vax in my life, really. Concerned vax, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you're recommending, I don't know, you recommend HPV, you recommend all the standard, right?
I still do lots of vaccines for people all the time, like tetanus shots and things like that. Like, I'm not anti-vax in any way, shape, or form, and I don't really think I get labeled too much as anti-vax. I've just kind of been concerned about particularly the males between like 18 to 29, like that age category, and it's more or less just like, I'm not anti-vax, I'm just pro like risk benefit. Like, let's do that analysis.
Right.
And I think for some people, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, like, I do think that the vaccine was very helpful at the beginning, because there was a point in time when over 90% of people who were in the ICU or were hospitalized were unvaccinated. right?
Right.
Now that number did change. Why did it change? I think most part was because of natural immunity, and now, we don't really have, how many people are unvaccinated versus, vaccinated in the hospitals, because, the number kind of has faded away. But it looks like, natural immunity is the prime reason why hospitals are not overloaded right now. But I would say that at some point, like, particularly, I guess, early 2021-ish was probably the main time, or in 2020. During that time, there was, I think,
Right.
less hospitalizations and deaths because of the vaccine.
Right.
Right, because it did provide some protection to people who didn't have natural immunity at that time. So
Right.
yeah, I'm not anti-vax at all, but I am like pro risk benefit. So if you already have been infected and you have natural immunity, you're low risk, you're a younger person, like, I can't really see how getting another vaccine is going to provide you with any, like, I don't think that benefit is going to really outweigh the small risk. I mean, maybe
So
I'm wrong, but
now you could say
that's what I
that, you
see.
could say that boldly, right? You could say that boldly because NASA's behind you, right?
Yeah.
But look, some people are going to say you're just a hack. You're paid for by the government. Your opinions, all of it's tainted. I can't believe anything you're saying. You're pro-vax 2021. Oh yeah, of course, you're a government employee, right? But so the question is, and this applies to anybody in the industry. At the end of the day, it's you evaluate this by a deep conversation with the individual, and you could, once the reasoning starts to switch, or they're making statements that make no sense, that's where the flags come up and like, okay, yeah, I think you are being a bit influenced by loyalty to people rather than to principles. And so
Yeah.
that's where I see major flags when I see lack of adequate reasoning in response to reasonable arguments. So when people start attacking character during the middle of a scientific debate, I'm like, that's okay, now you're getting dicey. Like, that's no. Or totally flawed logic, well, get vaccinated because it's still lower risk than getting COVID. I'm like, you're not, the decision tree is not between injecting someone with COVID and injecting someone with the vaccine. That logic never made sense. Even those who say, well, it's going out during the height of the pandemic is literally like injecting yourself with COVID. Not really, that so people always said get vaccinated because it's still less risky than getting COVID. I'm like, you're not logic. So, and maybe that's not loyalty to people, maybe that's just fear. But anyhow, the point is, it's important. Yeah, full disclosure is, I mean, it's big in the pharma industry, right? I think they're getting they try to do a good job with disclosure, conflict, all that stuff. You know what I mean? I think they try very hard, and it's, you can get a lot of information by digging.
Yeah.
And it's all, doctors have to disclose, researchers have to disclose their conflicts. And as soon as people see it, they're like, oh, there it is. Invalidate the study. It's funded by CDC. Invalidate the entire thing. I'm like, well, no, don't penalize them for being for giving full disclosure. Analyze the study, but I think it's still right.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we only have maybe 10 minutes left or so, and there's one question that I wanted to ask you about. Of course, I have to be very careful when asking you this question, but I think you had some concern about the CPSO's language regarding MAID, and you had a tweet where it looked like it said that if a patient is in, and again, I should look at the exact wording of it, but essentially it said that if a patient was deteriorating or at the end of life, you should really consider having, or you must have a conversation with them about MAID.
No. So, okay, no. So it wasn't about MAID. No. It
Okay.
was you must have a conversation about the entire end of life package.
Okay.
Okay. And so the question I had was, well, okay, is that what doctors now are like? Now you're getting confused. Don't get confused. You don't have to, from the policy, it doesn't say you have to offer MAID,
Okay.
but it's confusing. It's the same thing why doctors were so confused about medical exemptions. These are like kind of like guidelines. You must discuss end of life care. Well, end of life includes MAID. So I guess I have to discuss MAID. You got to talk to the college about this. You got to get in front of that council meeting and ask, like, get that on the record. What exactly is their detail? Like, I wanted to hear from council. Because doctors, man, I can't say this highly enough. I got a bit of a conflict of interest on the spiritual side, but my line in the sand, it's not a line in the sand. My red line is you do not inject anybody with lethal something to kill them. Put it like lethal use of force against someone who um, is not a threat to you is a I don't know, leave that for another topic. I have grave
Yeah.
concerns about that. Leaving a medication aside for them to do it themselves is one thing, or giving them a button, but to actually inject someone, I know that but the point is for the CPSO on this, they've left it a bit unclear, and it's important to clarify exactly what their policy is, because yeah, doctors are going to get confused. They might feel that the CPSO is going to come after them for not offering MAID. Like, it's unclear. And maybe, like I said, there's been news articles where, and reports of people being offered MAID. Like, look, it's part of the package. You don't have to accept it. I'm not coercing. I'm not, doctors aren't coercing anybody, but it's there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
someone at a vulnerable point, man, you get canceled on Twitter for making any kind of statements like that, right?
Yeah.
Like, look what happened to Jordan Peterson for making he didn't even suggest MAID, but he made some silly comment about, someone considering removing themselves from the problem of overpopulation, like a real roundabout.
Yeah.
And he got in trouble because the mere mention of, end of life decision, irreversible end of life decision, that's not a good idea in some situations. So anyhow,
Yeah.
CPS, yeah,
It's definitely a tricky topic, and they have a very, very difficult, um, a difficult job, for implementing that, because,
yep,
if someone, you know, has ALS or something, devastating, I can totally understand why someone may want to do that. And so I understand why the service is being
right,
offered. But
right,
yeah, I mean, they have a very, very difficult job, to implement that and to write the policies that would, reflect kind of, everyone's beliefs. I think
right,
it's more or less impossible, to really satisfy everyone or make everyone happy on that topic, because
right,
it's such a heavy topic that can divide so many people. So,
right.
I do kind of, sympathize with them in that regard.
And that's where I'm kind of like, I hear that point. Like, there's a chart. The Supreme Court of Canada has now said, if you refuse to provide this service to right, if you refuse to provide it, you're violating their charter rights, and you'll lose it all as a doctor. If you don't comply, you're going to lose your license. You're going to lose everything, because you're violating their charter protection. You are violating their human rights. Okay, what can I do to just dodge around this? Like, let's say, so, in certain religious traditions, you cannot, it is impossible to inject someone with a poison to kill them unless they are a physical threat to your well-being. So for those folks, I think there's still an exit under the law, but I don't even know how this is going to play out. Like, what if those
Yeah.
folks say, I cannot do it? Well, okay, you have to, or you can use your license. Well, no, my religious belief says I cannot. In my religious belief, it's flat out murder. I can put the medication aside for them. I can
Yeah.
give them a button to press. I cannot actually physically inject them. I don't know how the courts will land on that. Like, if everybody, took that position and there was nobody to offer MAID. I don't know. I appreciate that this is a dicey topic. And people that think they're right, they're like to become zealots. So I don't know. This is
Yeah.
my
Well,
next chapter.
that's why we're having, discussion, and we need to have more discussions. And, I think through more discussions, we'll be able to get better answers and better policies. But it is a very, very heavy topic. And I don't know if there's ever going to be one policy that's going to, satisfy everyone's, medical and, spiritual beliefs in this case, because it is such a heavy topic.
Well, and right, and so where I've landed with that is, okay, well, let's look at what's the community. Let's look at the global community is doing right now, and Canada's taking a leadership role, and that's kind of what also irks me. It's like, okay, well, if we're not clear, let's turn to the global standards, and Canada's like at the forefront. I'm like, okay, well, that's good to be at the forefront in some things, but in this, like with what this government's doing in other areas, like I'm a bit leery now. Like, so, but I hear you. These tough conversations that are going to have to be had at some point.
Yeah. And one thing I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I saw that you tweeted out the other day, the WHO came out, the World Health Organization, and they said that they're now going to look at the origin of the virus, and it looks like they're putting the lab leak theory on the table. Is that correct?
Right. She slid it in there, that doctor. I was very impressed. You talk about tricky roles, conflicts of it, like wow, she danced around that. And I think I used the word eloquent, but it was well handled. She slid it in there after the common what do you call it, zootic explanation, and she's like, or it could have just been a lab. Like, so very glad they broached the awkward discussion, right? A bit of intuition, common sense, made a lot of people wonder at the time when the fact that there are these labs in that area of where it started. But it's beyond. I mean, it's if that is the case, and like, where do we go from there? It's like there's so many of these labs around the world. I don't even know. You talk about cost benefit. Like, what do you know? What these labs have, like, what have they done? Like, we should know what.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to give you a good answer on that one, unfortunately.
Right? They got us the
Yeah.
vaccine for COVID, I guess. That's kind of what these labs have done for us. So I guess, but wait a second, where did COVID? I don't know. I'd be curious to see, maybe your viewers, your internet sleuths, what vaccines or what developments have come out of which biolabs around the world. Cancer cures. Maybe the cost is worth it. I don't know.
And again, like, it's just, the whole thing is not necessarily like proving that the lab leak theory is true, although maybe in fact, it is true. And, I think that a lot of really, really intelligent people now, do think that it is true. I mean, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Dr. Martin Makary, Dr. Martin Koldroff, like, Stanford, Harvard level educated doctors, professors, like, that's where they believe that it came from. So, if you have people with, prestigious qualifications who are, very, very well credentialed physicians saying that, they think that this is where it came from, that should at least then be on the table. And that's the problem, is that we're not allowed to have a discussion about the lab leak theory.
Right.
It's not about proving that the lab leak theory is where it came from, although it does look like that is its in fact origin. The problem is that we were never able to have that discussion in the first place, and that's where we need to improve going forward. And that's where some of the legislation and stuff that you've talked about today, and it being unlawful, like, we have to protect free speech. And if we had free speech, if more healthcare professionals were able to actually talk about COVID at the beginning, and a lot of people are talking about it now and kind of come out because there's been so many studies that have kind of debunked a lot of the public health policies. If we just had more discussions at the beginning, then I think that we would have had better policies, and we would have had probably fewer lockdowns. Maybe some people wouldn't have been vaccinated unnecessarily. We would have taken into account natural immunity more. Like, we just would have had a better time, a better result with COVID had we had people protecting free speech and allowing doctors to speak freely.
So, okay, not to play devil's advocate, okay?
Yeah.
But I think I tweeted at one point, can democracy be a threat to public health? Right? I think they took that position. I think they took the position as, if we allow too much discussion, it's gonna cause pandemonium, or it's gonna cause chaos. I mean, even though this is probably wrong, might be wrong, it'll be the least deadly wrong solution. So let this research say, is there studies to show that democracy is a functioning democracy is a threat to public health? Let's do the research on that. But I hear you. Let's maybe the best ideas would have surfaced earlier, and we could have saved a lot of lives had doctors not felt intimidated to get, I don't know, or to get the word out there. So, but you're right, labeling things, and that's what, again, the badges of fraud and the disconcerting. When not me, but like when anyone's labeled racist for suggesting that the lab came out of Wuhan, I mean, there are racist people that might use that to form judgments about an entire group. Yeah, okay, fine. That doesn't mean the theory, or that anyone who had proposed that theory, like it could have also come from Winnipeg. It could have also come from labs in doesn't make me, I don't know, like, or in the US, right? The idea of exploring these things factually without necessarily lumping someone as a racist or as ignorant or a conspiracy theory, evaluate the argument. And now this is coming up in other issues too. Like, I see now in the what's considered hate speech, just the mere concern some parents are expressing now in Ottawa about how to make a policy for transgender kids in bathrooms. Like, it's not everyone's it's not hate speech automatically just because you're flagging concern. Like, there are ways to have this discussion, have reasonable disagreements over how to create new policies, and labeling it hate, labeling people racist is just, again, you go back to the use of force, like you're just using that as an excuse to shut down all conversation, drag people out of meetings, put them in jail. Man.
I hear
Yeah.
you. On that note, though, we are out of time.
Okay.
Is there anything else that you wanted to mention? And please tell people where they can find you on Twitter, all about your law firm, and
Uh,
anything else you
well,
want
yeah,
to mention.
yeah, you can find me. I don't come on to, I don't do this advocacy for my, people find me, if they need my legal advice separately, but my advocacy is kind of just me trying to keep the system functional. So Lion Advocacy on Twitter, there'll be some new fun stuff coming out there, but right now it's just me tweeting. I think I have a website, but it's just basically the website has also documents that I found were relevant. But yeah, follow me on Twitter. There'll be some fun, entertaining stuff coming down the pipes. So
I agree. I started following you a little while ago, and you're a great follow on Twitter. So everyone listening to this, Lion Advocacy on Twitter.
awesome.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and thank you so much for coming on, Dan. And as always, I'll be back again next week.
Thank you.